Hi there. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, great. So my name is Prashant Agarwal, and I work for a company called Fjord, and we are a digital strategy and design firm based in Europe, New York, and we actually now have an office here in San Francisco as well. So I'm going to talk to you guys today about mobile design. How many people here actually have a mobile application or think about mobile design for applications? Okay, so a lot of you. Okay, great. So what we're going to do is, what I'm going to talk about is, I'm going to talk about three things and really give you a perspective as how we as designers actually approach mobile design. So first I'm going to talk to you about designing love, because that's actually one of the ways we really think about this. It's a very emotional thing. And then I'm going to talk about context. In mobile, I think we can all agree that context is an incredible kind of key component to what you're designing for and how we think about designing for context. And then I'm going to share some lessons learned, some practical tips and tools that we kind of keep close to us every day. So why do we start with love? Well, there's really three fundamental reasons. So the first one is, so just hang on, I'm getting a little bit of echo. Do you guys hear that echo as well, or is it just me? Just me, okay, great. So three reasons we think about love as being at the core of the design process and why we should be trying to design love into our products. Well, first of all, love is a fundamental kind of human kind of need and behavior. So we all want to experience love, whether it's in our interpersonal relationships or if we, just wanting our software creations and applications to be loved by the people who use them. The second reason is that we've seen this over and over, is that value of products and services really increases towards the heart. So if there's a very strong emotional connection to your service, that's actually going to increase the value in the user's perspective. And so as an example of that, there's a couple of different types of companies. So if you think about products like Kodak Gallery or Google Docs, they're great. They actually speak to kind of a very functional, logical kind of part of your brain, and they do a very specific thing. But then if you compare that to services like Flickr or Instagram or Evernote, people have a very different kind of relationship to those products because they go beyond just the functionality, but actually solve a very sophisticated a problem in a very simple way, but a very sophisticated problem that actually makes people feel better. Similarly, if you think about kind of enterprise software like SAP, very functional, very sophisticated, but if you compare that to a much simpler product, which again isn't going after the same enterprise market, but if you think about the products from 37 Signals, people have a very strong emotional tie to those, and they actually value those products in a very different way. So we think that there's a really important contrast, and when you think about your services, think about that emotional element. In mobile, I think specifically, I don't think we can forget or underestimate the strong emotional value that people have with their mobile devices. So, whether it's showing off, my collection of apps on my phone, or using these devices as life recorders to capture and share kind of important, intimate moments, or kind of the way that we actually communicate with people that are important to us, your mobile experience is already a very emotional experience. So how do you actually design love? What are the rules for thinking about your application from this design love perspective? So there's three universal stages to training true love, whether it's in life or mobile application design. So first there's this notion of matchmaking. Then of course you have to go on a few dates before you can actually find true love. And what that means in digital is, like, matchmaking is of course about discovery. How do I actually stand up from the crowd and actually stand for something? Dating is getting someone to engage and try something out. And then of course true love is about loyalty and kind of being there for the long haul. And in terms of what you want to think about from the user's perspective, matchmaking is about that, aha, I didn't know I could do that before. Dating is about, oh my God, this actually works. Wow, that's unbelievable. And then true love is, of course, this is the way it should be. It should work. And I'll come back to the required characteristics in a second, but another way to think about this is that these are kind of the stages when you think about, if you're mapping this over time and thinking about engagement, is that matchmaking is about that aha moment. The challenge is actually how do you ride the curve to creating, going from the wow moment to the of course moment. Because one thing about the wow moment is like a lot of people focus on whether it's visual, like a lot of functions, or a visual wow. Designing for wow actually has a very short-term novelty effect. So that you also have to thinking about how do I go from aha to having wow, but actually going into what we kind of focus on, which is of course design. So if you think about some of the services and applications that you use every day, I'm sure you have like examples of like, oh, I like this product because this is the way it should work, and it does what I think it's going to do. So let's give some examples on what this actually means. So as you guys know, it's incredibly competitive out there, and there's a massive fight for timeshare, whether it's to stand out in this crowd and get someone to actually look for my product. So a first thing you got to do from the matchmaking perspective is really designing a hook. What is my product actually about? What is my application about? What am I actually doing? And I think Instagram is actually a really great example of this. So for those of you not familiar with Instagram, it's a mobile photo sharing service, and what's amazing about it is that it's not as if mobile photo sharing services didn't exist. It's just that they actually really focused on the mobile aspect of photo sharing and realizing that cameras, the cameras in our phones are actually very sophisticated, but we can actually use these devices as photography devices by having a simple quick capture, but then adding value by adding some quick effects to my photos. And this has completely disrupted the idea of kind of traditional photo sharing services. So if you consider this compared to a service like Flickr, which has this huge photo sharing community, they kind of completely missed the boat that it's not just about community and professional photographers, but everyone is a photographer. And if you add a quick way to make my images have more photographic value, you actually kind of can reinvent photo sharing. So the next piece is actually just thinking about how you're going to engage with your users and what it means to actually go on a date, so to speak. So there's kind of two elements that we really focus on. First is the engagement funnel. How do I actually get someone to actually engage really quickly? And for us, the most important thing is really, 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 really make it quick and easy to start. So two really good examples of this are if you guys have signed up for, I know I'm probably getting in trouble for mentioning Square at a PayPal conference, but I know that they do think about it quite a lot as well. Is if you think about something like Square, which actually enables you to accept credit cards, they've made it brain dead to actually sign up, order this device, launch the app, and actually start accepting credit cards, which traditionally has been a very challenging process. And actually make your device, and actually have people have the aha device, like, wait, my device is actually now a point of sale mechanism. Similarly, I think Zipcar has done a fantastic job. If you guys are Zipcar members, which is a car sharing service across the U.S. and globally, it's really simple to sign up. You get this card, you show up to, you book a car online, you show up to the car, you swipe your card, and you're in the vehicle. And an example, there's a lot of competitors now that are kind of in this space. So Hertz, which is a full-service car rental agency, has a product called Hertz On Demand. And I signed up for Hertz On Demand recently, and the experience is like you sign up, and then you don't hear from them for 3 weeks. You have no idea where you are in the process of actually the registration. And then they say, oh, you've been accepted. We're going to send you a vehicle entry device. What's the vehicle entry device? I'm trying to just get the car, right? And so they don't really go along with the user journey and actually make it easy to understand what is this actual service about. So making it really simple to get started is incredibly important. And beauty. There's still we certainly have moved away from the idea that design is about just making things look good. It's actually really about how the product and service works. But beauty is actually still a really important element in getting people to engage with their service. And there's a couple of different ways. We definitely think of beauty and visual richness as something that serves the purpose of what the service is about, not so much just about the visual wow itself. That's not actually enough to stand out. So a couple of examples of this are we designed an IPTV remote for Ericsson. And this is actually a touchscreen remote that lets you navigate your DVR, your on-demand broadcast television through a visual timeline. And it had to communicate a couple of things. One is that you can go back and forth in time, but also you can actually navigate thousands and thousands of pieces of video and audio content. So there's the visual richness that actually draws you in and makes you explore the experience. But then there's also things like if you guys are Citibank credit card or banking customers, we designed Citibank's iPad application now. This is a pretty brain simple like banking application. Log in, get my account information, but we could actually create a lot. We focused on creating a lot of glanceable richness such that you have a good sense of kind of what your account balances are, so you can get in and out of the application really quickly. And then, of course, you probably are familiar with Flipboard. Very simple visual design, but has a lot of tactile feel to it. So you feel like you're going from page to page, just like you would in a real magazine. So those are examples of where you can use different elements of beauty to drive engagement. And then true love. So what does it mean to actually? How do you actually get someone to become loyal to your service? And I'm going to share, there's actually a bunch of different examples, and that actually speaks to kind of what is your service really about. But I'm going to share two examples which I think are really powerful, particularly these days. So the first one is fluidity as kind of the foundation for love. And this is about how I get someone to reuse my service all the time and actually become really a part of their lives. And if you think about services like Netflix or the Kindle, for example, by Amazon, Netflix has done a tremendous job of first, on-demand video, fantastic. But the fact of the matter is that what works really well is not only do they have great content, it's the fact that that experience actually works seamlessly across multiple devices. So you can start a movie on your Roku device, you can watch it on your iPad, and you can pick it up again on your iPhone. And that fluidity actually makes it something that I want to keep with me and can constantly tap into. The Kindle, I think, is another fantastic example of that. So it's not only just about the device, but it starts with the fact that when I get my Kindle device, it already knows who I am because it's already tied into Amazon one-click. It's already my device. But then that experience and kind of putting the book in the cloud and following me around makes the Kindle kind of a service that I think of beyond just the device and the reader. And I think a second one, again, in a related way, is this idea of ubiquity. So especially in terms of mobile services, thinking about the fact that I've got this device with me all the time, where does that device kind of fit in my daily context, and how does it work throughout the day? And does my application of service, where does it fit in terms of my days? Is it something that I only use in the morning, or is it something that I use at lunch, or is it something that I use in the evenings? And really thinking about that user journey that the person is going through and how that fits in terms of when are they going to pull out my device, or when are they going to pull out their device to use your service. And that actually is kind of a nice segue into context. So as designers, we actually think and talk about context a lot. And I suspect as mobile developers or application developers, you think about context a lot. But it's good to unpack it a little bit and think about maybe a slightly different perspective on it. So we think of context as actually having kind of, broadly speaking, two kind of elements. There's the technical nature of context and what capabilities we have in our devices and services, and then there's the most important, the human element of context. So when we think about mobile services and mobile design, the technical part is actually things that we can detect with sensors or derive from users' data, so like tapping into someone's calendar. In general, what's technically feasible. And I think a lot of people tend to start at this part, which is actually kind of where people get stuck. Because ultimately, the bigger picture is actually about understanding humans and kind of their behaviors and their intents. And this is not stuff that you can necessarily just ask someone. A lot of it comes from a lot of observation and keen insight and trial and error over time. So so we talked about what these things are, and one of the things that's actually what's really changed in the nature of digital experiences and context in general is that we've transitioned from this mode of creating one experience that kind of fits one very rigid context, and then sending it out to lots of people, where we're actually now we expect our digital experiences to actually understand our context and cater themselves to us, and actually we have to build that flexibility into the service. So we're not looking for mass solutions, we're actually looking for very tailored solutions, even though we're all using, say, the same photo sharing service. So we tend to start here And in thinking about context, what we need to do is actually kind of find this balance and move down closer to the human level. So how do we actually create smart experiences for people? So the myth is that there's this really clean curve, and that the more sensing technology you have, i.e. be able to read people's context better, the better user experience you'll be able to create. So let's take an example of a product that tried to do that. So Color, I don't know if you guys use Color as a photo sharing service. The idea was that it's going to be really, really simple for me to create collaborative photo albums with my friends because we're all going to be in the same place. So no real user interface, not a lot of explanation. You took it out, you're like, what photos are around here? And you would see photos that made no sense to you. So it really kind of failed in terms of, it knew where you were, it might even know who's in the room with you, but it wasn't really sharing or kind of creating additional value in that experience because it didn't explain it very well. So it was a big failure. And they're actually now pivoting. Bold try, but didn't quite work. Probably you guys were all familiar with this example of a software trying to understand our context, but actually ultimately just getting in the way of what we're trying to do. So I think we want to actually figure out how to avoid this. So yeah, Microsoft Office knows what button I clicked or what I'm trying to do, and it shows this paperclip guy to me, and it's not really helping me. So the myth is, we actually think that the reality is that context actually, if you try to read too much into context or have too much awareness, you can actually have a drop in user experience. So the reality of this is that this is kind of like a much more complicated thing, which is that there's actually a point at which you can get to where you can get enough context to actually increase the user experience, but then there's this massive kind of valley, and it's very hard to jump that valley. Yeah, we all want to be on totally the right side of that valley, but it's very difficult. We tend to get stuck in this in the valley here. So failed context systems, and the reason we get stuck is that they tend to try to over-understand your needs, they misunderstand them, they remove options based on what they think you need, they might even share your information inappropriately. But at the end of the day, they often are also just creepy. So I'm sure you all have examples of things that have tried to do things on your behalf, but really just kind of like, why are you doing that? I don't understand. And really, there are two sweet spots, and it's actually fine. Actually, it takes a lot more discipline to focus on the first sweet spot and get to that. What's the low-hanging fruit that you can really get to? And actually, that's a place where most people need to start, because there are very few examples of people that actually cross the chasm, so to speak, and actually get to that other side. So I actually created these slides before the iOS 5 or 4S, iPhone 4S example, but Siri is actually a really great example. So if you guys have used kind of the version of Siri that's been out on the market for a while, it does a very good job of telling you what it's actually capable of, having a very conversational response to you, and actually kind of being a good friend, but also tells you very clearly when it can't do something. But they've done a very good job, and it's actually incredibly hard, and when we all get our iPhone 4Ss, we'll see if it's gotten any better on Friday. So what are some simple rules to kind of think about how you actually create better smart services that are contextually relevant? So there's actually a very simple formula for this, which is it's all about finding a ratio between the benefit to the user and the cost to the user. And if you find that right ratio, you can actually create a really successful experience. So the first thing you need to do is, this sounds obvious, but you would be surprised at the number of startups and companies we work with that actually have mapped out their entire interface or information architecture and their service, and they've got all these wireframes. It's like, so have you talked to any users about this? No. Okay, so put users at the center of your process. That's probably the biggest difference between a design-led process and kind of a technology-led process, which is that we actually think about users' perspective first, and we use that as kind of our driver. So the first thing you can do is reduce the cost. It's actually infinitely easier to reduce the cost, and that inherently improves the experience. So that is, be really transparent about what your service is, how it works, where the user has control, and kind of security. Those are things that reduce the cost for users. then you can actually think about how to improve the benefit. This is actually much, much harder. So increasing the benefits, examples of that would be personalization or adapting to the environment or doing something automated on their behalf. And you can see when you come back to this kind of the two sweet spots that it's much, much easier to focus on reducing the cost. And then eventually you can start focusing on increasing the benefit. And in fact, if you reduce the cost and get people to engage, they're going to communicate with you what their benefits what benefits they want, and then you can start moving in that direction. Okay, so these are kind of some just general frameworks that we think about every day. So what are some practical tips and tools for mobile design? So the biggest thing that we end up dealing with is how do I scale across multiple platforms? So I think, from July 2007, it was all about the iPhone, but then it rapidly became about Android and all the 50 different flavors of Android and all the other devices that are on the market. And increasingly, the only way to do this is actually don't think about the devices up front. Actually think about what your actual experience is, what's your actual service about, and map all of it out kind of in a very generic format. So create that information architecture, create the flows, invest in that, and actually abstract it from the actual individual platforms as much as possible. And if you do that and actually invest in that, it will be much, much easier as you go and then go forward and actually pick. And then you actually have to pick a lead platform, and we'll talk about that in a second. I think one of the problems we often see people doing, and if you have 100 developers and you have 100 designers, maybe you can do all of these things in the same time, but that's actually very rare. We haven't seen much of that be very successful. So we have some really practical rules for this. So the first one is, it actually makes a lot of sense to invest in iOS first, and it's not just because of the reach. That's actually the easiest answer. What we've actually found is that with iOS, it's much more consistent because there's less fragmentation. So it actually makes it much easier to scale. And so if there's naturally more consistency in the platform, it allows you to kind of your design dollars will go further. Whether it's internal design dollars or you're working with an agency, to create a more consistent experience, which will be easier to scale, and that in general creates a better experience for users. So start there. You can then move on to additional platforms, whether it's Android or Windows Phone or BlackBerry, whatever is important for your target segment. But one thing that we found is over and over and over is that your Android adaptation will take much longer than you think it will. And the reason for that is there's just a lot more inconsistency, whether you're just doing for straight up kind of the default Android experience or all the different variations in devices and platforms from the different OEMs. So you will spend more time iterating and tweaking your Android design than you will with your iOS design. So you will get to market much, much faster. The other thing we've learned is that don't just assume that going from portrait to landscape will be really simple. It actually requires scope that time in and really think about what you're going to do in each of those contexts, because there's some great places to innovate there, but they don't come cheaply in terms of time. So make sure you build the time in for that. And then there's the last two rules that we tend to use all the time, and we really think about it in terms of every decision we make is, first of all, design for speed. In terms of the tasks that you're actually enabling, particularly if you're doing a native application, because this is where you lose people really, really fast. And of course, some of it is out of your control. Sometimes it's on the network, but you can kind of make decisions along the way that actually make up for that. So in every action, going from screen to screen, button to button, click to click, really design for speed and getting people through the process that they're trying to achieve. That will get you huge points with users, and if you think about the apps that you use every day, I suspect speed has a lot to do with why they're easy to use. And the last point is edit ruthlessly. So it's really easy to come up with a list of features, but what you want to do is actually want to cut that feature list down, focus on putting as much of that stuff on the backlog, and actually really focus on what we call minimum viable experience. So what's the minimum thing I need to do to actually create real value? And your minimum, it's all relative. Your minimum might be very different if you're creating an enterprise application that someone's paying for. But the reality is that you should be throwing away 90 to 95% of the iteration that you do and honing in the 5% of that output to create a really good experience. Your mileage might vary, but it's a good benchmark. So in terms of in terms of speed and actually seeing stuff on the screen, so it's really important to actually look at your designs and your flows and actually test them on the device. So not everyone actually has access to an engineer who can mock this stuff up really quickly. So there are some really great tools out there that are incredibly inexpensive or sometimes free that allow you to very quickly mock up your flows, lay out buttons, and actually get them into in a really simple clippable format onto multiple devices. So one that you could try out is Kinotopia, which is actually a set of very sophisticated, very rich PowerPoint Keynote widgets that you can create your screens and flows and put them together and then create a clickable PDF out of them. It's super useful. And once you actually see the stuff on the screen, you'll start making decisions that you didn't actually anticipate by if you were just doing wireframes or visual designs. And this is a question that we get a lot, and I missed the previous talk, which I think actually covered a bit of this, but I'll give you our take on it. Should I be doing a native application in these days, or should I start to invest in HTML5? So I suspect some of you who already have services out there are already starting to kind of go through this debate internally. And so our take on it is, first of all, have you defined your core user experience? So start there. Execute that on your lead native platform because you'll get there faster and the tools are out there, the market share is out there. Refine that native user experience and really get it to where it needs to be kind of in state of the art to be competitive and kind of get to where you're going. And then once you've actually done that, start prototyping in HTML5 and see if HTML5 can actually support your interaction model and your flows, because if you get back to what I was saying earlier about kind of speed, if you put something in HTML5 and it scales across multiple devices, fantastic. But if it does it in a way that's really slow, you just wasted your time. So you can start prototyping there, kind of see what the capabilities are, but actually really kind of test the stuff to see if it actually has kind of the speed of the experience that's really important. Because right now it's kind of inconsistently implemented, and we're finding that it's not really a good example. It's not really something that you want to invest in across the board. If you want to see some examples of what is actually possible for inspiration in terms of HTML5 applications, OpenAppMarket.com is kind of just a directory of apps out there that are kind of implemented in HTML5. I mean, some of these you've seen. You've all seen the Facebook HTML5, Safari version, or the Twitter mobile Safari version. Those are really good examples of very app-like features, but they've again spent a lot of time thinking about kind of, does HTML5 support my experience? So there's some great other examples there of games and things that people are doing in HTML5. So that's it. Thanks. If you have questions, please let me know. There's someone walking around with a mic, I think.
Hi, my name is Sylvan. Just have a quick question. Maybe you have some war stories around using platforms that are cross OS, so things like PhoneGap. I just spoke to the guys from Accelerator outside, and yeah, maybe you have some war stories. That'd be cool.
Yeah, so great options. Again, it depends on what your business objectives are. The thing about using those platforms is that they are actually creating kind of lowest common denominator across those platforms. So you actually have a compromise in terms of your ability. Now, they're constantly improving those services. I think of using services like that as more about a technology implementation. It's actually somewhat independent of the design you want to do. So the first thing I would do is actually invest in the user experience, design it, and then see if your cross-platform tool will actually be able to deliver that or not. And again, it depends on the nature of your service. If you have a very simple kind of content-driven service that doesn't have a lot of sophisticated applications or interactions, those services actually might be a really smart way to scale. If you're a Lonely Planet and you're cranking out an app per travel guide that's really content-driven and you want to be on multiple platforms, might be a really good solution. If you're creating a really sophisticated application that has a lot of rich visualizations, interactions, and creating something really engaging, we found that those things kind of often fall short. So it's a bit of perspective. It's a bit of like how much budget do you have? I mean, they work. It's just a matter of what they actually output. And if you're, I think in most cases, we haven't seen design-led projects kind of live up to the kind of designs based on using tools like that.
So I have a question. This is not related to the design, but coming to the question of iPhone versus Android.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. The question I have is that till some time the perception is that Android users do not spend money on apps. In fact, that keeps a lot of app developers from developing their apps for Android. All Android fans, Android users, that's actually true. But things are changing right now for Android because Android is getting into the high-end market, which it did not have till some few months back, to be frank. So have you done any research about Android versus iPhone monetization?
Not on the monetization side. I mean, I think what's happening on the Android side in general is that it's not that the devices are becoming higher end. I actually think that there's more lower end devices that are coming out. That what's happening on the Android side is that as an operating system, it's becoming more mainstream. So as it becomes more mainstream, you have fewer early adopters that are like just going to spend the time to find the free apps. What's actually happening is people are like, I want to solve this problem really quickly. What's the fastest way to get this functionality on my device? I think the bigger problem that Android has in general right now is that there's just a lot of inconsistency of the experience because of the fragmentation in the market. And so if you look at every single ODM, they all try to make Android better in their own way, and they're actually doing it to varying degrees. And so, if you use an HTC device, and you have HTC Sense, you might never need an application. So you might never actually engage with your smartphone beyond the kind of the widget layer. In fact, all seven panels are filled with widgets. So there's not actually that much, there's not room to actually engage with the device and actually personalize it in a really simple way. So I think there's going to be a balance. I mean, I think what's happening is, again, Android is definitely becoming more mainstream. You'll definitely see people, OEMs kind of like dialing back their experiences and finding ways to create more personalization. And that will drive more engagement in terms of people looking for apps and kind of personalizing their experiences. Right now, it's actually still really hard, I think, for most users. I think the reason there's so much better engagement on iOS is that it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but it's just simpler to get engaged with. So, I mean, the best metrics for this actually are still like, if you look at browser share, right? It's a simple thing. Both platforms have browsers, but the browser usage on iOS devices is much, much higher. So monetization follows with engagement of the platform in general, and there's still kind of like, I think, there's great strides, and it's an amazing platform. From a user's perspective, I don't think they've kind of gotten over the hurdle in general yet.
Hi, it's Salim Manaj with Mobile Breeze. My question regarding to design is, I wanted to ask if you can touch base on this. So like the App Store has about 500,000 apps in there.
Yep.
So there's a challenge to creating sort of intuitive apps, but at the same time you have to find a way to differentiate and build a brand. I just wanted to know, how do you guys approach that, and what should the experience be in that?
Right, so I guess the thing that we think about is that app stores aren't actually strategies. App stores are distribution mechanisms. You still have to do all the normal marketing stuff. So you still actually have to have a good product, and you still have to get the message out. What an app store does, it actually makes it really easy once I've decided I want this to get it onto my phone. So if you're focusing on discovery within the app store, you're not going to win, right? So I mean, you have to kind of round it out with kind of a broader set of marketing objectives.
I guess sort of my question was, let's say you're doing a photo sharing app,
Yep.
right? And you get it on TechCrunch. If it looks like the other photo sharing app and someone sees the screen, they just don't know what your app is, right? So you got to create sort of a unique look and feel and experience that yet is still very like user friendly, but it's different enough that resides in people's memory, that they see it next time, they're like, oh, I didn't know that. This is XYZ app. That's a good app, right? That's my question, basically.
Right. So I would actually argue that the heart of your question isn't actually about the look and feel, because the look and feel actually serves the actual benefit of the app. So if you're creating a photo sharing app, your look and feel needs to serve why it's a better or different photo sharing app. So Instagram is a really good example, is that, yeah, I can take a photo, but what I can actually make that photo artistic in one click or one swipe, and that's what it's actually really about, and then see other people's things. So if you focus on what the core benefit of your services, and then the design needs to flow that. So I was talking to a friend of mine last night who's doing a mobile CRM service, right? And he's explaining to me what this is and his whole process. And he says, yeah, I feel like we missed something in our process. We went from like, we know exactly what our users need, and we went off and like wireframed this whole thing, and we have like 150 screens of wireframes. And yet it still doesn't feel right. What they skipped is a really important part, which is actually, what's the concept? What's the guiding principle and the organizational principle that actually gets people to do the tasks that they need to do? And so that's where that differentiation often comes, is actually in that concepting work before you do the detailed design. So there's 10 different ways to enable the thing that's different about your app, but actually you need to figure out which of those, explore those different ways at a high fidelity, at kind of like a high level before doing the detailed execution.
Yeah, we actually have a tweet question. So coming from Song Zun Huang, and the question is, do you have examples of areas where HTML5 fails for a mobile app?
Oh, that's a good question. Off the top of my head, I don't, because most of the people are kind of staying within the constraints of HTML5. I suspect those kinds of things actually happen more in the kind of in the lab environment when people are trying to find things and they find that actually making compromises in terms of the nature of their service because they can't do what they want. But I suspect there's probably a lot of people in the game area that have spent a lot of time trying to create HTML5 games and find that they can't do the sophistication of games they want.
Okay, thanks.
Just quickly back onto the Android thing again. You mentioned that there was a lot of iteration that it took to get onto the various devices. I was wondering if that iteration was mostly trying to get things pixel perfect versus the design, or if it was just trying to get it to work at all. I mean, like, what is the level of functionality you're actually trying to hit with the various fragmentation?
Yeah, a lot of it comes. It is a lot about the pixel perfectness. That's where you will spend a lot of production cycles. I mean, obviously, you want to spend some time saying, like, you know, Intense allows a slightly different experience or a better feature that I couldn't do on other platforms, so let's take advantage of that. That stuff's fine. I mean, you should definitely invest in that, and you can say, like, you know, this is the way this works, and so this is how it ports over to Android. But what you'll find is, like, the number of, like, you'll produce your production guides and your assets, and you put them on an iOS device, and they work. Right? Then you debug the code, and you make the experience work better. You put them on an Android device, and they don't work. Right? And there's a lot of inconsistency. You've got to tweak pixels here, pixels there to make it work in addition to everything else. So it's that iteration, I think, is probably, it's a huge overhead, especially if you're testing on, you know, if you're testing on 10 devices, it's a lot of overhead depending on how big your team is. If you're testing on 50 devices, and they are actually really different, and then you add tablets into that, it gets even more complicated.
So do you think it's important to really be committed to your pixel perfect design, or is it okay to be flexible? Where do you maybe draw that line?
Well, hopefully Google's going to solve this problem for us, right? I mean, that's kind of what Ice Cream Sandwich is going to help address to some degree, right? So I say you should always try to stick to the pixel perfect design because, you know, as a designer, our take is like it's those details that make, it's those details you can't actually see or actually notice, but that still kind of resonate in the experience. Again, it depends on a little bit on the nature of your app as well, and if that's going to make a difference to your audience. But yeah, I would stick to that.
Hi, Sarat from Orion Pro Solutions. Quick question on how do you address designing for iPhone versus iPad? I mean, you know, there's a great difference in the user experience, and if it's the same app. And you want to deliver a different experience because of the increased screen real estate, all that good stuff. So I was just wondering if you have pointers on that.
Yeah, there are two different apps. So the way that we think about, so it's pretty interesting. I've been doing mobile stuff for a long time, and mobilizing your service used to be a really simple thing. It was like your thing lived on the web or lived on the desktop, and you had a smaller screen that could, with less bandwidth, that could do less stuff. So it was really simple to hone in on what was really simple, right? The iPad and tablets in general have kind of like thrown that whole thing off, right? Because it kind of can do what my PC can do. It kind of works kind of like my phone. And so what the perspective that we've taken is that don't think about with tablets, it's actually changed the way we think about the way we approach service design, for example. So it's not about creating channels. There's not a PC channel. There's not a web channel. There's not a mobile channel. There's not a tablet channel. Your service is actually a system. and it lives across different touch points, and those touch points need to be complementary. So don't try to recreate your experience on the iPad. You want to create a different kind of complementary experience to your mobile experience. So there's a couple of really good examples of this. If you are a music fan and you've used Rdio, the Rdio, which is kind of a Spotify competitor, the Rdio iPhone experience, yeah, it's the same functionally, but it's completely different on the iPad, and they actually kind of created a different experience in the way you browse music. Another really good example is actually the Facebook application, right? So the Facebook iPad app has a very strong concept about content consumption, and it's really about photos. So technically, it has a lot of the same functionality as the iPhone app, but the iPhone app is kind of this very typical 9-up, get me into a task, and get me out, where the iPad app is actually about sitting back. So they might be using the same back end, but they have a very different user experience context. And so you got to actually invest and say, how do those two work together? So obviously not all your customers are going to have a smartphone and a tablet, but really it's not about actually replicating your experience on the tablet. It's actually about creating a complementary experience.
Hey, one thing that mostly I face challenge in designing these apps is when I focus more on this user experience, it always takes a drain on the battery life. Right, so when I come up with some cool features where I love to give a very realistic user experience, what happens is the battery starts to get drained more. So I just wanted to hear some more insights about have you come across such stuff in your user experience designs? How did you handle that?
Yeah, I guess I'd have to look at how you define what you're putting into user experience design to make your battery life kind of drain. So, I don't really have a good answer for that. We haven't run into that problem as much. I mean, we definitely focus on kind of what is the battery life, but I don't think it's the UX that actually changes that. I think, if you have a lot of animations and transitions, yes, that's going to impact your battery life, but do they actually serve your information architecture, or are they for wow? Because if they're for wow, then, they're not actually adding value to your experience in general. They're they're a novelty item.
It's just not animation, right? So when you are talking about having an app where you do a lot of e-commerce, you actually need to talk to the server more frequently and try to pull a lot of data.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes there are cases where we actually store small bits and pieces of data in files and we try to render that. But then that takes a toll on the performance of the app where the cache size increases. But on the other side, when you actually try to pull a lot of information from the server again and again, your battery drastically starts to reduce. But it's not drastically in the sense like from 70 to 50, but at least your app has a say in as you start using that for quite some time.
Right. So it's about the chattiness of your application to the back end. And I guess the question. So there's actually a good example of how you pre-cache and how you actually avoid showing that to the user, and maybe pre-caching more aggressively. So, for example, an example someone gave me the other day is the ESPN Score Center application. They actually make you wait at the splash screen with like a tip of the day or some bit of information. And what's actually happening in the background is actually fetching a lot of the data in one massive call. And so they're making less frequent calls. So you actually can create a good experience by making people stop for a second, provide some value in that pause, and then use that to your benefit to do something really efficient in the background.
Just following up on that question, you had highlighted speed is really important. Pre-caching is one of the key elements. Can you speak any more tips from your experience in terms of how to make the application really fast, especially with regard to bandwidth and download?
Yeah, I can't actually, because I'm not actually an engineer. I think it's actually understanding the nature of your application and whether it's going to be connected. So one thing I think people do overlook is what's the value of their app in offline mode, and that might be a good way to start thinking about what happens after I logged in and then go offline, and what's actually on my device. So that helps you prioritize what you're going to send out to that device when it is connected, and how complete an experience you want to create in offline mode. So use that as kind of like a thought experiment in terms of determining what you're doing and what you're caching, right? And how far that experience goes in offline before you got to be connected again. Great. Anyone else? All right. Thanks, guys.